So good evening, everyone. My name is Laurence Gauthier. I'm a historian here at the Centre de Sciences Humaines at the CSH. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all this evening and to welcome our speaker, Dr. Aditya Balasubramanian. Dr. Aditya Subramanian is a senior lecturer in history at the Australian National University. He completed his PhD at Trinity College, University of Cambridge, as a British Marshall Scholar and a Cambridge Trust Scholar. His dissertation won the Ellen MacArthur Prize in Economic History. And so his first book, which is based on his thesis, is entitled Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. It was published this year by Princeton University Press. It is a history of economic ideas and politics in post-colonial India. And the book was shortlisted for the 2023 Elder Prize in the Social Sciences of the American Institute of Indian Studies. I will not say much more about the book because Aditya has come here to present it this evening. In parallel to this book, Aditya is working on new research projects. One of them is entitled Roads to Progress, Infrastructure and Transport in Modern India. It looks at the environmental and economic history of road building and transport in modern India around the 1940s to 1970s. And this project interrogates how the political economy of interest groups, federalism, and resource usage have evolved over time. Aditya is also working on another research project entitled Family Business, Commerce between South and Southeast Asia. This is an interracial, inter-imperial history of family businesses across South and Southeast Asia from the mid-19th century to the 1950s. And I believe you're also doing some work on anti-corruption because you have an article coming up in the Journal of Asian Studies entitled Anti-Corruption Development and the Indian State, a History of Decolonization. So lots of research projects going on. It's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. So we're also welcoming this evening Dr. Ishan Mukherjee, who will be the discussant. Ishan is Associate Professor and Associate Dean at the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. He completed his PhD in history also from Trinity College, University of Cambridge, where he was a fellow of Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. Prior to joining Jindal University, Ishan was also worked at EPW, Economic and Political Weekly. His research work is on decolonization, social violence, and state building in South Asia, with a focus on Bengal, especially in the 1940s and 1950s. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you both this evening. Just as a quick reminder, so this evening we are discussing Aditya Subramanian's book entitled Toward a Free Economy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or good evening, I suppose, everybody. So thank you to Dr. Laurence Gauthier for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you to Professor Ishan Mukherjee for taking the time to read this book and to be my discussant. I'm honored to count both Laurence and Ishan as my friends, and also as scholars whose work I greatly admire. But particularly recommend to you Laurence's essay, A Laboratory for a Composite India, Jamia Millia Islamia around the time of partition, on the visions that are articulated and projects pursued by Jamia vis-a-vis Aligarh and the relationship to the Nehruvian state. I think such work is especially important in the current moment. And I'm eagerly anticipate, as I'm sure the rest of you do, the release of Between Nation and Community, Muslim Universities and Indian Politics After Partition, which on Cambridge Core drops in January, but in print a little later after that. And now for Ishan Mukherjee. Well, it brings me great nostalgia to think of the night of Ishan Mukherjee's PhD submission. Oh, what a night. Not late December back in '63, like in the song Four Seasons, but March 2017. A very special time for me. What a scholar, what a night. I was tasked with proofreading some chapters of this dissertation, and our friend Miral Shafat Bukhari, another set of chapters. I'd already known that Ishan was a fine scholar from his essay, The Elusive Chase, War Rumor in Calcutta during the Second World War, from the volume Calcutta, The Stormy Decades, edited by Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and Tonika Sarkar. But what I learned that night is that my friend is somewhat surprisingly a rather efficient manager of people and teams as well. So that dissertation was copy edited, printed, and bound by an assembly line of people. And Ishan, I'm proud to say, has been pleasantly surprising me ever since. He has probably been one of the three people, the other being my supervisor and the third being my father, who has read everything that I write. And that means the world to me. I think a lot of people will laugh and gossip with you, but few will take you seriously. And Ishan always does his friends that courtesy. So let's begin. Can I start with the PowerPoint? Yep. The clicker's not working. I think we have to put it in full screen mode. Great. So let's begin. We might start by considering the motivations behind this book. Above all, the abstract question that motivates my book, Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India, is how can we better understand India's simultaneous escape from colonial economic stagnation and the persistence of the democratic form, which was introduced to a largely poor and unlettered people, but in a critical fashion without celebration nor with undue misery. For most of this period, the umbrella Indian National Congress has been in power in the center and key states in the country's Westminster-style federal system. Led by Prime Minister Nehru, the Congress introduced planned economic policy that sought to consolidate a heavy industrial public sector and bring about what was called a so-called socialistic pattern of society, unquote. The legacies of the Nehruvian era loomed large. Indeed, for most of India's post-colonial history, a project of statist economic policy associated with heavy industrial central planning reigned, even if in implementation it ran into difficulties. It wasn't quite upon that ideal type. But in contrast to that earlier era, the post-1991 period has been characterized by economic liberalization and private service sector-led growth. Accompanying this changing economic landscape, the right-wing Hindu nationalist politics of the BJP has come to dominate both the center and key states in the Indian political system. In the states, regional and caste-based parties have asserted themselves increasingly. Congress has been reduced to a shadow of itself. This period has been characterized in social scientific literature, especially in economics, as a sharp break from the past. But India was always a mixed economy of private and public sectors, with the majority of Indians engaged in informal private activity. And despite the dominance of the Congress, political opposition was given the space to emerge and advance alternate agendas. Toward a Free Economy argues that during the 1950s and 1960s, a non-sectarian right-wing politics embracing an alternative economic paradigm to planning emerged in the form of the Swatantra Party, or Freedom Party. This was a politics associated with a keyword of free economy against the so-called socialist planned economy of the day. The emergence of free economy as a discourse and as a political platform was driven by changes in Indian economy and society. Its major ideological constituencies hailed from landed and mercantile castes in southern and western India, several of which were transitioning to new forms of economic activity. Free economy's progenitors were not formal economists. Rather, they were politicians and publicists who had derived an economic common sense shaped by their experiences of regional and small town or mufassal political economy. Their ideas, expressed in various genres, drew on the idioms of anti-colonial nationalism and selectively interpreted transnational currents of free market economic thought. These ideas took on meanings that varied by region and language, by caste and class. And yet, four key characteristics united these varying divisions, a sort of lowest common denominator of sorts. Anti-communism, and we can talk about what that means. That doesn't mean just against the communists, also means saying that today you nationalize the airline industry, tomorrow you're coming for our heads, kind of rhetorical force of that in the Cold War period. Decentralized development, the advocacy of unfettered private economic activity, and the defense of private property. The movement for free economy took institutional form as the Swatantra or Freedom Party, which rose and fell between 1959 and 1974, although it was pretty much kaput after the 1971 elections. The movement was advanced through the Swatantra Party's project of what I have called opposition politics. And there are three elements of what I think that constitutes, which is not to say it's the only opposition, but the project is distinctive in the following ways when you look at the three things together. First, opposition politics means presenting a conservative alternative to the Congress as salutary for the health of a post-colonial democracy with progressive ideals. Might be slightly counterintuitive, right? Next, opposition politics means bringing economic affairs into the domain of public consciousness and mobilizing people around these issues rather than the concerns of caste or religion. And that's a conscious choice. Swatantra sought to get Indians to interpret economic considerations as a key part of their citizenly lives. Through its attempts at communication and mobilization, it offered Indians an alternative economic program and helped entrench economic claim-making as part of democratic practice. Third, opposition politics meant using the institutions of India's tripartite system of government to check the power of the ruling party. Swatantra sought no less than to lay the foundations for a two-party system and invigorate Indian democracy. Unlike the communists or the ethno-nationalist Bharatiya Janasangh, forerunner of today's BJP, which were the other key parties of the left and right respectively, Swatantra considered democracy an end in itself, whereas, of course, according to the communist theory, you would have the dissolution of the state, or in the, according as Christoph Jaffrelot reminds us, the Bharatiya Janasangh's project was ultimately to bring India to some quality of 100 Mahajanapadas or something, which doesn't really have democracy in the sense that we think about in the parliamentary fashion. So, what scholarly contributions does this may offer? I mean, we're in the CSH, so hopefully you will tell me that these are just my humble aspirations. Okay, so first, the idea is that I try to reveal that in the heyday of the Nehruvian era, there existed powerful and politically organized constituencies for alternative market-friendly policy, right? By making a careful study of the regional and caste context in which this emerged, the invitation is to reconsider aspects of India's post-colonial or independent history. Second, the book tries to show that despite India's formal non-alignment during the Cold War, there was a pitched battle of hearts and minds that played out between an Indian anti-communist print culture and more popular left-leaning literature, which we cannot reduce to the designs of Washington or Moscow, or the funding of Washington or Moscow, as is sometimes done. And third, moving beyond the historiography of South Asia, the book tries to rethink the history of economic thought as a history of economic and political consciousness and communication rather than economic theory. To do so, it consults an extensive archive of print and visual culture. And finally, the book shows how local ideologies about political economy develop, inflected by colonial era practices and ideologies, regional trends, and contact with the rhetoric of the outside world. It offers a perspective on the market turn in the second half of the 20th century from the perspective of non-Western societies and their concerns. Indian economic conservatives came into contact with and selectively borrowed rhetoric from self-identifying neoliberals of the Mont Pelerin society of the likes of Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, even though they were not meaningfully neoliberal themselves. Unlike these economist interlocutors, my protagonists viewed markets as something to be part of democratic politics rather than something to be protected from and part of an anti-democratic, expert-driven vision. So let's begin in the port city of Bombay, Mumbai, where a flour mill owner called Ranchordas Lotwala rechristened his Institute for Indian Sociology as the Libertarian Social Institute in 1947. It was here that the term free economy was coined and discussed. Ranchordas Lotwala hailed from the Gujarati language speaking Halai Lohana caste. The image on the slide shows that the building that houses the Institute Library, which is today operated as the RL or Ranchordas Lotwala Foundation Library, although probably should be called the Kusum Lotwala Foundation Library, because the person who is actually doing the day-to-day running of this library is Ranchordas Lotwala's daughter Kusum, who gives up a career as an All India Radio hostess and a sportswoman to essentially support the father's vision. And by this time, he's quite old and living, in the outskirts of Maharashtra, outskirts of the city. And so that the labor of Kusum is what makes free economy viable. Although, of course, when you search obsessively, even for 10 years, like I have, you still can't find photographs of her, which is the nature of this. Okay. Lotwala's family had lived in Bombay for centuries. Ranchordas converted his family flour trading shop, Lot means flour, into a machine-operated flour mill, an example of the transition to new forms of economic activity highlighted in the book. Since World War I, he had been a patron of various anti-imperial and social causes. Lotwala took part in journal editing and sponsorship with the profits from his mill and organized various discussion groups. Once India became free in 1947, he directed his attention toward the ideal system of political economy. The history of how the keyword free economy emerged in this institute and spread all over India illuminates A, how anti-colonial idioms and institutional forms were repurposed in the post-colony as part of a conservative project. B, how an idiosyncratic mixture of transnational contacts and texts from overseas helped free economy take shape. And C, how anti-communism played a significant but hitherto unacknowledged role in shaping the trajectory of ideas and politics in Nehruvian India. As free economy moved beyond its original utopian conception, this discourse started to be connected to a critique of Indian political economy. Although it primarily circulated in India's English language print public sphere, the discourse also managed to reach more populous regional language publics and even seep into the Mufassal. By the mid-1950s, it was yoked to the demand for opposition to the Congress and formed the basis for the Swatantra Party. Free economy emerged against the backdrop of the Indian state's promulgation of the ideology and practices of planned economic policy. I know that Nikhil Menon, my friend, has been one of your earlier speakers in this series and has written eloquently on this topic. As you can see from the still of the government film, Tomorrow is Ours, there you go. Planning was seen as a vehicle of progress. It was accompanied by a rhetoric of socialism. India's expert-directed five-year plan started in 1951, but built on policies initiated during World War II. These policies pursued a strategy, or the plans pursued a strategy of import substituting industrialization that privileged investment in heavy industrial activity led by the public sector. Planning was financed by foreign aid from both superpowers, by increased taxation, and by increased deficit spending. It led to nationalization of select private enterprises and efforts to redistribute land to redress unequal ownership. Private industry was tightly regulated and commodities and currency exchange controlled. The social foundations for free economy were laid by tensions that emerged between three interest groups growing in number and prominence: the government bureaucracy, professionals, and business people operating local and regional small and medium-sized firms. Paralleling the state's expanded duties, the bureaucracy expanded in size and power. Whereas in the colonial era, the smallest unit of administration had been concerned almost exclusively to collect revenue, The post-colonial state sought to direct and expand production, also provide a modicum of welfare. Between 1947 and 1968, employment rose from 3 million to 9.9 million across layers of government. Sarkari or government employees became the human face of the expanding Indian state. They enjoyed stable jobs and oversaw the dissemination of resources and practice of policy in an economically insecure country. These new faces of the state encountered a growing number of civilians in the professional classes, the second of these new interests. Between 1941 and 1971, the ranks of India's professional classes with some form of higher education grew by 1 million. They concentrated in the cities and took advantage of opportunities in a growing economy. But they could also witness and comment on the shortcomings of India's attempted political and economic transformation. The Libertarian Social Institute published a biweekly journal called the Indian Libertarian. It maintained a press, a bookshop, a research institute, and a residential hostel for about 45 people. It sponsored essay competitions and hosted weekly discussions. For Lotwala, libertarianism stood for limited government and prized individual liberty. One institute editorial defined free economy as follows. Free economy is an economy which is free from monopoly, privilege, and control of state in various forms, as for instance, monopoly of exchange, credit, quota, licenses in land, money, and trade. We run counter to the present-day fashionable slogans of socialism, communism, and planned economy. This was a clear response to increases in commercial regulation and plans for the nationalization of industries being pursued in India at the time. The third of these interest groups was small and medium-sized businesses operating on enterprises of less than 200 people, concentrated in the former Bombay and Madras presidencies. These smaller units were not a priority of planning, but the private sector accounted for between 1/3 and 1/2 of increased manufacturing capacity and grew between 7% and 8% annually between 1950 and 1965. So it was both the new urban professionals and the commercial groups that broadly began to feel the pinch of the state and the power of the bureaucrat. And that might be through either rising prices or taxes or red tape. And so it's frustration with these aspects of daily life that comes through in the conversation, debates, and papers of newspapers and magazines like that of the Institute. It was in this environment that Ranchordas Lotwala and Kusum Lotwala built the Libertarian Social Institute. Many of the people who were associated with similar projects and formed their interlocutors were lapsed communist internationalists, left libertarians, and anarchists who had been pushed rightwards ever since the expulsion of Trotsky from the Soviet Union and the subsequent purges by Stalin of his rivals from the Communist Party. The Libertarian Social Institute stood at the center of a connected cluster of English-speaking periodicals and associations scattered across urban India, but with circulations that indicated that they went deep into the Mufassal, as well as something that we can verify qualitatively through reading letters to the editor. The chart in the slide gives the circulation figures for these periodicals that help us understand perhaps how they spread or how free economy spread. While less than comparable magazines of the left, which are indicated in asterisks, right, Blitz and Seminar, these figures are not inconsiderable. They point to two categories of magazines: more ideologically dense, right, lower circulating magazines, indicated in red with the yellow background, right, and higher circulating magazines, indicated in black, but with the gray background. So the members of this cluster of periodicals and associations did much to help each other. Right? They often advertised for each other. They, you could bundle subscriptions from one, you would get, subscriptions from multiple others, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in this environment, right, that free economy begins to spread. But free economy is vague in the way it's articulated, right? Lotwala says that, it's not laissez-faire. It's an economic order which allows no monopoly of economic power to any class, where each individual could develop his own talents and personality. And you can hear the echoes of Marx there, right? It also, and it's actually the inability to offer elaboration, right, which we think as intellectual historians is sort of problem, is actually what allows free economy to bring together diverse visions of alternate economic policy. So these voluntary associations, right, like the Libertarian Social Institute, had been the key vehicles of politics before the advent of mass nationalism. They're repurposed in the post-colony. So for the anti-colonial figures of different stripes who come together in this cluster, right, anti-statism had been just as important, and is and was and had been just as important as anti-imperialism. Right? And so in the changed political context, they return to this associational politics and kind of shift to purely anti-statism. So overseas, the key intellectual influence for the libertarians was the American anarchist individualists, and they were associated with the critique of the New Deal and of urban industrial life. They also have other organizations who are based in India who provide various kinds of, based overseas, who provide various kinds of support, like the right to publish Indian editions of their work and to syndicate magazine articles. Some of these organizations send discounted materials to the Indian libertarians and disseminate free literature in an era of kind of scarce foreign exchange. So the Indian libertarians and their interlocutors were not purely interested in questions of political economy. And they often had debates about various kinds of positions that they took. So for example, some of these major disagreements that arise are the Indian libertarians find the Hindu nationalist editors of the Organizer magazine to be too attached to caste Hinduism and superstitious, while ignoring the allegedly so-called rational concerns of political economy. What united these organizations, right, is the anti-communism and aversion to the Congress Party. And so articles in their journals point to essentially try to raise alarm, right, and basically say that what's happening in India is going to tend towards authoritarianism. So just to get back to the question of how does all of this spread? Bilingual intermediaries are the ones that develop and disseminate ideas between the elite English language speaking public and more populous regional language publics. Right? There's a sort of famous article by Niladri Bhattacharya about notes towards a conception of colonial publics, and I'm trying to push that toward the post-colony and thinking about these various different kinds of public and their relationship with each other. It is these intermediaries that help spread free economy beyond its English language origins, which is intelligible to about 5% of the population. They string together new and unlikely alliances. So in this respect, the most important figure is C. Rajagopalachari, the former right-hand man of Mahatma Gandhi, and now a bitter opponent of the progressively minded Congress under Nehru. Yesterday was his birth anniversary, which was very exciting to some Congress Party politicians to show you how back we've come. But retired by the 1950s, he still kept himself rather busy from the southern city of Madras and wrote regularly in the weekly Swarajya or Self-Rule magazine. Rajagopalachari had been profoundly shaped by the slow commercialization of small town or Mufassal India and its associated dislocations. Since his early life, he worried over the risk of the abuse of power by the state's personnel and influence peddling to win elections by hook or crook. According to him, India was a permit license quota Raj. This was an oligarchic coalition of large commercial interests, Congress Party politicians, and bureaucrats who distributed permits and licenses to enforce controls of the planned economy. It was a polemical coinage, but it had some thrust, which is why you still continue to hear it used today. The logic ran that business donated to the coffers of the Congress who instructed its bureaucrats to give them favorable treatment, and the people suffered. While the old British Raj had gone, Rajagopalachari suggested that a new Raj of the Congress had come to stay. Only a conservative party could create balance for Indian democracy by offering hope of a two-party system, he argued. Rajagopalachari started to call for free economy as the key platform for such a new party and co-founded the Swatantra or Freedom Party in 1959. Swarajya's Tamil language sister publication, Kalki, conveyed the discourse of free economy by commenting on local and regional rather than national economic affairs, or when it did, deploying agrarian imagery to do so, as in this cartoon that is displayed. The finance minister, C.D. Deshmukh, is portrayed as a farmer chasing the deficit away, and the deficit is a goat, right? You see it here, it says Nidipatra Kurai. And the goat is trying to eat a sapling, right, which is labeled as Irandavadu Aindu Varsha Thittam, or second 5-year plan. The target audience for this literature would have been sections of the Indian society growing increasingly literate and educated during this period. Between 1955 and 1960, when publications like the Indian Libertarian came into being, periodical circulation in India rises from 11 to 19 million, pretty significant. Magazines like Kalki, which is circulation of 6 times Swarajya, so it's 100,000 to Swarajya's 10 to 16,000, right? Penetrate deep into the Mufassal. So, free economy becomes a keyword associated with projects in southern and western India, right? In a slightly more professional version of this slide, I would have actually labeled them. But anyway, I'm sorry. But you're all very smart, so you can figure out what I mean by South and West. So anyway, so in colonial times, these regions bordered by Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal were governed largely. I mean, of course, there's a lot of difference and distinction and local particularity, but broadly governed by Rayatwari rather than Mahalwari or Zamindari. Right? And under this system, revenue was collected directly from landowning peasants without the use of intermediaries at a lower rate than the other tenurial regimes. So tenants have slightly more security against being thrown off the land. Right? Now, there's also long histories of Indian Ocean and overseas trade. Of course, the Rayatwari type is more of an ideal that masked a much more heterogeneous reality. But constituencies from these regions will invoke this history in the post-colonial period and identify as self-employed owner cultivators, right, to protest land reform. So the regions, so let's kind of move to this question of what exactly does a decentralist project of free economy look like, shall we? So we move from Bombay to the fertile Charota tract of the Gujarat region in Western India to the town of Anand and the adjacent Vallabh Vidyanagar. These are both experiments in private cooperative economy, with the village as the basic unit of economic organization. During the 1950s, Anand develops as a center for milk production, right? And Vallabh Vidyanagar, or town of knowledge, becomes the home of various educational institutions focused on science, technology, engineering, and commerce. And so these two towns, Anand and Vallabh Vidyanagar, buck a broader trend of urbanization between 1950 and 1970, when 47 million Indians move into cities. The region's dominant Patidar caste reconciles local social identity and regional geography with foreign ideas and expertise to implement this rural modern vision of free economy. Whereas the dominant vision of agrarian cooperatives in India at the time was about common ownership of the means of production to dissolve inequality across castes, this cooperative form entrenched the dominance of the landowning Patidars. It transformed them into powerful regional capitalists. The success of this endeavor relied on leveraging in-group networks, small town activity, private philanthropy, and state-facilitated access to resources. As free market ideas traveled outside the West, they found surprising areas of contact and engagement. But Indian interlocutors engaged and incorporated only that which was appropriate for them. The Charotar Patidars continued to privilege family and caste over individualism. They derived and formulated their ideas in an agrarian or agro-industrial rather than an industrial society. Key preoccupations of the likes of someone like Milton Friedman, like the issue of floating versus fixed exchange rates, were completely irrelevant. On the eve of independence in 1947, Anand's Patidar farmers united to throw out the Parsi company that paid them below wholesale prices for their milk before it was sold in Bombay. These farmers organized themselves into two levels of cooperatives: individual village cooperatives to supply the milk, and the Kaira District Cooperative, Milk Producers Union Limited, or less clunkily, Anand Milk Union Limited, or AMUL, which you should hopefully have all eaten in your lives, which would process and bring the milk to market. So AMUL's Patidars overcame teething challenges to expand the scale and scope of their production with the help of foreign ideas and expertise. After studying successful milk cooperatives in New Zealand, AMUL diversified away from milk into milk products. Right? So it starts to dry milk into powder, extending the shelf life. Right? And then the union also hires an American-educated engineer from outside the community, Verghese Kurian, to oversee operations. And interestingly, Verghese Kurian is the nephew of John Matai, who is the finance minister who quits when the planning commission is founded. So not to draw too many connections, but there you are. So my factoid for the evening. The Patidars retained local control, but incorporated necessary know-how from abroad to direct their own transition to agro-industry. You can see that in the image, right? So you have they're control of the process, but then they're using foreign technology and all of that. So in-group caste ties and identification with a shared past form the basis for a turn to industry. And if you follow Sharad Chari's work, this is, I guess, another instance of what he calls fraternal capital. Okay. So Vallabh Vidyanagar, pictured in this map, educated Anand's populace. Founded in 1947, it was intended to help reverse brain drain and keep Charotar tract Patidars close to home. Its creation is detailed in co-founder Bailal Bhai or Baikaka Patel's Gujarati memoirs, Baikaka Naam Sansmarano. The 500-odd page book provides a rich perspective, inaccessible in English or the formal archive, into how a local notable conceived of and implemented an economic vision. Now, full disclosure, this was translated for me, so I can claim credit or punishment for the English, for the Tamil and Hindi in the book, but not for the Gujarati. Although I think it was done very well. So, anyway, Baikaka was a career engineer who was inspired to pursue this endeavor by India's first Home Minister and fellow Charotar Patidar Sardar Patel. According to the memoirs, the project relied on Prabuddha Swarta, or enlightened self-interest. Baikaka created a private cooperative trust to coordinate the project. The trust secured land grants from 500 Patidars to the area christened Vallabh Vidyanagar in return for half of their land back after the development of the area. Appealing to community interest as self-interest, the trust further secured charitable donations from Charotar Patidars across the country and in the diaspora. An industrial cooperative was created to build the physical edifices and infrastructure of the town. By the mid-1950s, a number of educational institutions had sprung up, all clustered together. But notwithstanding the rhetoric of self-reliance and the praise of private activity, the project also relied on the labor of non-unionized lower caste workers, right? And government approvals for land acquisition and construction came more quickly thanks to the connections to the Home Minister. Vallabh Vidyanagar's flagship university also became, which was any guesses for what it was called, Sardar Patel University, also became interested in anarchist individualism and free market thought. The American individualist who had inspired Ranchor Das Lotwala worked there as a consultant for several months during the 1960s. His name was Ralph Borsodi, and designed the general educational curriculum. The head of the university economics department, one R.K. Amin, was also a member of Hayek and Friedman's Mont Pelerin Society, and even spent some time visiting the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman visited Anand and Vallabh Vidyanagar in 1962 with his wife Rose, and they wrote about it in their memoirs, which are called Two Lucky People, but unlucky for perhaps others, and they call it a high spot in their time in India. So, economic concerns also took center stage in the politics of the Swatantra Party. During the 1920s, as is well known, this community had staged some of the first major anti-tax protests against the British Raj that inaugurated the era of mass nationalism under Gandhi with Sardar Patel at the helm. By the late 1950s, they had repurposed their politics around two key issues. The first was a perceived urban bias of resource distribution by the government. In his memoirs, Baikaka complained of the poorer quality of food rations and inadequate infrastructure spending in the village. And second, they opposed attempts to impose land ceilings on formerly Rayatbari holdings and redistribute land to tenants. So in a very striking passage of the memoirs, Baikaka says that tenants and landowners are like blind and lame. And if you pry them, and they rely on each other to survive, if you pry them apart, as the Congress has done, you will destroy Gujarat. So Baikaka quits his job as chairman of the trust in charge of Vallabh Vidyanagar to found the Gujarat Swatantra Party and goes on to become leader of the opposition in the state assembly. So unlike organizations in the Western context, like, for example, what was influential for the Indian libertarians was the Foundation for Economic Education, right? Where they're a group that essentially takes short form versions of writings by free market economists and write various kinds of short stories, fables in a sense, to try to convey the importance of the division of labor and markets and all of that, and then disseminate it widely. In the Western context, this is possible, but the progenitors of magazine free economy in India could not rely on magazines exclusively to spread their ideas, as most Indians at the time could not read. So the Swatantra Party brought free economy to the forefront of their electoral politics. What did that mean? Among the things that it meant was disseminating pamphlets and posters filled with epigrammatic visuals. It meant marching on the streets and chanting slogans. Although Swatantra's leadership did not see democracy as a means to popular emancipation, their project, I would suggest, was still democratic, but we have to think about what exactly democracy means. To its leaders, democracy was a form of government that sought to bring stability, ensured by a target imagined middle-class constituency, and an opposition that checked the power of the dominant party. Free economy was never a mass ideology, but still, Swatantra goes further than most political projects. It helped a group of Indians negotiate their enfranchisement by modifying their idioms and practices of mobilization. And long after the party's eclipse, the issues around which it rallied, inflation, taxation, corruption, would provide enduring basis for discontent expressed in electoral politics. By the 1960s, India faced food and foreign exchange shortages that put the brakes on planning. In 1966, the country goes on a 3-year plan holiday. As you can see on the chart, right, inflation had ticked upwards, although it wasn't extraordinary or anything like that. To help its finances, the government had increased indirect taxes, which are regressive. The Swatantra Party saw part of its role as pedagogical. It sought to convey that the neglect of agricultural investment and the deficit financing in the second 5-year plan of 1956 to 61 had caused these woes. But the party also exaggerated India's economic trials and tribulations to assault the Congress's legitimacy. Communication efforts included both pedagogy and polemic. In the slide, you can see the page from the party's pamphlet called "Who's to Hold That Price Line?" After defining inflation in a slide I haven't showed you, the booklet or the pamphlet, offers three definitions of money: a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of measure. Thus far, it is indistinguishable from a textbook, and many of you who had the experience of studying economics may have come across something like this, right? Now comes the polemical turn. The pamphlet introduces both an expanding number of state bureaucrats who drive up government expenditure and rising indirect taxation as causes of inflation in India. As you can see, there's a marked visual contrast between the rather large, expanding bureaucrat and the skinny, chained-up common man suffocating under taxation. Rather than constructive thought, the translation of free economy into electoral politics more often involved criticism of this variety. This visual literature was also presented in Indian languages and could take on more localized hues depending on who alliance partners and alliances of no competition were formed with. So this visual, so for example, if you see on this slide, is an image used in Madhya Pradesh titled Yojana aur Pragati ki Raah par, on the path to planning and progress. It shows a Bade Vyapari, right? Or big trader on a donkey that is called Congress, flaring the word Samajwad or socialism from its nose as it trampled over farmers, small traders, chote vyapari, workers, and Madhyam Varg Janta, or middle class people. This is an indictment of life in the permit license quota Raj, right? And then here, there's also kind of localized. So for example, in Punjab, the Swatantra Party decides not to ally with the Jana Sangh because their base is coming, their supporter is Udham Singh Nagok, and they're allied to the Akalis. And similarly, in the south, they're attached to DMK, right? In Madhya Pradesh, they are countenancing Jana Sangh, and so you see rhetoric like Dharam, Dharti, Dhan, or Danda, ko raksha kare, right? Now, so the target of this material was an ambiguously defined so-called middle-class citizen. Imprecise definitions in party memoranda ranged from a salaried employee with a family to those who self-identified as middle class to a self-employed person, which could be a farmer, an artisan, a shopkeeper, or a professional. So it did not map on to any really major constituency in a country that was riven by language, caste, and religion. Rather, again, it was an attempt to get people to identify with an ideal type. Throughout the 1960s, Swatantra did try to reach out beyond this target group, claiming in mobilization attempts to be India's economic caretakers. The most substantial of these events were the anti-inflation days and the anti-excess taxation days. I would suggest that these were novel in Indian politics, not because other parties were not doing similar things, but because Swatantra pursued these and associated activities as opportunities to disseminate their economic ideology without that much else going along with it as well. So on anti-inflation day in 1960, protesters wended their way across cities and towns nationwide. In the city of Pune near Bombay, they burned an effigy of inflation and signed a petition seeking the president's intervention to reduce prices. In Bombay, the party's general secretary read passages from the Free Market Mont Pelerin Society pamphlet on inflation to an English language audience. Similar activities took place on Anti-Excess Taxation Day, and various material distributed across India as part of the latter event appear on the slide. You can see the various different languages. An indication of how people understood what Swatantra was trying to do, and indeed of their own political and economic consciousness, is given from the thousands of correspondences and petitions received by party leaders. These are preserved as barely legible, uncatalogued microfilm rolls in the private papers. Yesterday, I met Ishan, and he commented on the thickness of my glasses. And these glasses, the thickness is responsible. What was responsible for the thickness was trying to decipher these microfilms. So on the slide, you can see a page of a Tamil letter from a village widow to Rajgopalachari. In it, she describes how the government had not made good on the loan it sanctioned to her to build a tube well and a surrounding wall on her property. So she had therefore had to abandon construction halfway. Now, she was being hounded for sequestering scarce water resources by villagers who had grazing rights in the surrounding land. They had reported her to the local revenue official, and the police. The widow asked Rajagopalachari in his capacity as a leader of opposition or Edirkatchi to publicize the issue and alert the people that they could not trust the government. In appeals like these, citizens invoked the opposition party as a kind of ombudsperson in their economic claim making. Some, like the widow, wrote on behalf of themselves. Some wrote on behalf of family and friends, asking for help resolving issues. There's one about the seizure of a Philips transistor that I found that was quite illuminating. Others wrote on behalf of groups, right? So these appeals invoked opposition to publicize and help address claims. They're also doing other things, not just that they're CCing the opposition leader. So they use a language of anti-incumbency. And I'd suggest that economic insecurity and observations about the abuse of public office had provoked discontent, right, with the country's development strategy that could engender sympathy to Swatantra, although I'm not making an argument about vote banks or anything like that. There are other categories of letters that offer support for the party, and still others that proffer lengthy opinions on politics and economic affairs or report on local party activities. To the extent that one can discern from surnames, right, and that's of course very fraught, correspondence hailed pretty much exclusively from scholarly, landed agrarian or trading castes. Not that surprising. But the material indicates a small critical mass conscious of Swatantra as opposition and as a salient part of Indian political life. As one might suspect, Swatantra's message seems to have registered especially well with those whose interests it represented. To others, the party mattered less or not at all. Free economy was ultimately circumscribed in its imaginary. Swatantra sought to introduce an all-India class politics that avoided issues of gender, religion, and caste. Party leaders did not believe in special appeals based on the recognition of difference, and a number of Swatantra's leaders were at the Constituents' Assembly and were, more along the lines of uniform civil code type of thing. The middle-class citizen was always a man, and to Swatantra's leadership, the enfranchisement of women did not imply their political emancipation, but rather the extension of their private subordination to their public political participation. The Maharani Gayatri Devi was among the very few extremely elite officials of the party. She appealed to women of her constituency in one campaign event by appealing to their domestic responsibilities. As I or you wouldn't like to keep our house dirty, the municipality should be responsible enough to keep the city clean, she said. Few Swatantra Party leaders hailed from lower caste or minority origins, and those who did, like, for example, the MP J. Muhammad Imam, came from uncommonly wealthy families, like playing polo and this sort of thing, like some of our classmates. Yeah. So the Swatantra Party enjoyed its most major success in the 1967 elections, when it won 44 seats in the Lok Sabha, or lower house of parliament. This was not a huge footprint, but that year, the Congress saw its majority substantially reduced and failed to form the government in several key states for the first time, evoked in this kind of classic EPW essay by Rajni Kothari called The Change of 1967. Swatantra used parliamentary debate and procedure to increase the accountability of the ruling party and make this legislature more than a rubber stamping institution. It made use of regional credentials to insert itself into contests that sought to pit the opposition party of the region against the center, through mergers, coalitions, and alliances of non-competition. After 1967, it thus formed the opposition in 3 key Indian states. And finally, Swatantra mobilized citizens and appealed to the judiciary against perceived legislative overreach by the majority to defend the right to property, inserting itself into key Supreme Court cases on bank nationalization and the abolition of privy purses. If imagining a conservative party and communicating and mobilizing the electorate around economic issues were the first 2 dimensions of opposition politics, and using the institutions of government to check the party in power was the 3rd dimension. A few years after its greatest success, Rajagopalachari died, and a split in the Congress led many of Swatantra's leaders to join one of that party's 2 factions. But its true significance was never electoral or entirely of the past. Free economy and opposition politics helps us understand post-liberalization India's trajectory in context. Today, the communities who got behind Swatantra wield disproportionate influence over the economy relative to their size as key regional capitalists. Some of these communities shift their political allegiances as convenient. Others have left countries like the United States to seek out their economic fortunes. Still others support the dominant dispensation. And it is in that context that has driven some public intellectuals, journalists, and others to argue for a revival of the broadly non-sectarian Swatantra Party as an alternative home for conservative constituencies in Indian society. In that spirit, when we think of the elections in May, I would say that there are three things to end from Swatantra's history that deserve our attention. First is the possibilities of decentralization in a federal polity that has seen a trend of increasing centralization over the last decade. Second is the critique of vested interests connoted by permit license Raj in a country where regional capital has been decimated. You read Seminar 2020, Rahul Verma and Rohit Chandra's edited special issue, you'll get a sense of that. A few conglomerates close to the government have prospered wildly, where caps on corporate donations to political parties have been eliminated, and tax-free electoral bonds allow anonymous donations, the benefit of one party especially. And third was a commitment to avoiding religious bigotry and holding majoritarian elements in check. And on that, I'll close with an anecdote from Raj Gopalachari, who when he was age 91 and in poor health, he wrote to the editor of the Organizer magazine to say, ask him to stop running articles about warlike Muslim kings and tyrants. Not only do such stories serve no current purpose, he argued, but they do great harm. So projects like Swatantra, I would suggest, help us imagine alternative possibilities and solidarities to check the worst excesses of the present, even if they stand far apart from our utopias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditya, for this very enlightening and comprehensive survey of your book's main arguments. I now will ask Dr. Ishan Mukherjee to join us for the discussion. So,
hi, thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure, Aditya, to be able to introduce your book. And it is very special, you know, when you have seen a project bloom, as it were, from a PhD research proposal to that of a full-fledged research monograph. So it is really very special for me to be commenting on the book. Aditya has already given a very detailed description of the book, and no, it's great, and that reduces my work very significantly because I don't have to belabor myself or the audience, you know, to go over the basic points once again. I will confine, therefore, my comments to some very, very broad general issues, as it were. I will then follow it with a few questions, and then we will have a discussion. I will open the floor up. If I have a tendency to speak too much, so Laurence, please rein in if I go over time. I think, you know, I would like to identify 2-3 very, very broad and significant dimensions of the book, as well as projects of this kind, largely. You know, one is, I think, you know, the history of economic ideas. I think it is absolutely important, and I think this book makes a huge contribution to the field. You know, economics as a discipline, as it is practiced today in various academic institutions, try to push the discipline to a, you know, a sort of a niche which tries to see the discipline as entirely technocratic, right? That, you know, there is a tendency to mimic the exact sciences in some ways and argue that somehow economics is, after all, you know, the domain of the expert. And therefore, it is nothing to do with politics. Right? This book actually brings the discussion of economic ideas directly, it foregrounds on a field of politics. I think this is very, very important. It is very important also for public discourse in general, not to see the economy as something that only economists or mathematicians actually understand, but actually something on which any informed public has a right to comment, right, intelligently. I think history of economic ideas has the potential to do it, and I think this book does this work very, very well. And I therefore encourage all of you to actually buy the book and read it. And and very seriously, I think this is very important. The second, I think it makes a very important contribution to a global history of ideas. The way in which the field has emerged in the recent past, I think it makes a substantial contribution. It basically, kind of takes us away from reductive meta-narratives, of Cold War politics is one between, as a debate between capitalism and communism, as defined by United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. And it basically, what it does is, I think it does that particularly well, and I would congratulate Aditya for that, which is to basically see how these ideas are drawn upon, but selectively, right? And then reworked according to the convenience of the local context, right? So it is not a direct borrowing, from whatever discussion going on in the United States and in the Soviet Union. It's not removed from it either, but it is a case of selective appropriation. And from that, you basically look at how those ideas actually can be worked out in the context of India, both, at various scalar levels, as Aditya points out, at the level of the locality, the region, and the nation, and so on, right? I think this is very important. And this also challenges this, kind of, in economic history, there is this, huge sort of large meta-narrative that we talk about of the rise of neoliberalism, right? Of the global rise of unrestricted rise of neoliberalism with the death of communism, right? We see how neoliberalism in the Indian context is actually reworked in very, very significant ways to produce something quite different, which Aditya calls conservatism. And here I will, kind of, want him to comment much more. So I will frame a question around that. So that is basically broadly it. But there is also a third very, very important reason why I think at this point of time you should read this book, right? Which is, I think, in some ways I would, kind of argue a little differently from Aditya, the way he frames his conclusion. I think there is the Swatantra Party does not exist anymore. Am I right, Aditya? It does not exist anymore, right? Right. But the idea survives, and the idea survives quite pulsatingly. In fact, I think that there has been a Swatantraization of opposition in India. In some ways, if the Swatantra Party, the emphasis, in the attack, in the object of attack is different, right? If, during the heyday of Swatantra, it attacked statism, right? Or socialism. Now, I think the objective of attack is, say, crony capitalism. But the basic idea is very similar. It is different in emphases. So basically, what was attacked previously was the idea of this all-powerful state, which in some ways was kind of working in favor of certain big capital. Right. And here the idea is that, it is the domain, it is the, period of domination of big capital, which is now being supported by the ruling regime. And in some ways, the Congress opposition, the secular opposition in some ways, positions itself as the spokesperson of the small trader, the small entrepreneur, the rich peasant, and that kind of thing. Socialism, of that kind of the 60s and this, of the postcolonial type that kind of survived till the 1980s has been thrown out of the wind, right? So in some ways, it seems that opposition has the opposition rhetoric, so far as economic ideas are concerned, has seen a certain kind of continuity to the present day. So in some ways, Swatantra has never really died. Its emphasis has changed. What it attacked, what it attacks has slightly changed in emphasis, but the substance of the attack and the constituencies it pretends to speak for, that has kind of remained the same. Even today, the idea is that, the current dispensation functions for big capital, right? The Adani, Ambani capitalists, while the peasants of Punjab are overlooked, right? And therefore the idea is that the alternative economic vision, if there is one, is that of a state which would actually promote a very large range of economic enterprise of the people, as it were. So I think that is why it is very, very significant. Have I spoken too much already? 2 more minutes, I will ask 2 questions, right? One is, in the spirit of critique, which is not criticism, which is that, in some ways in the narrative of the book, and I try to read it as carefully as possible. I got the book about, a week ago. It seemed to me that there seems to be a tension, a kind of tension between, on the one hand, a deep recognition of the heterogeneity of ideas, right? That, that some are drawing upon neoliberalism directly, others are working through libertarianism. There is also, various kinds of free trade ideas and that kind of thing. There are liberals, Minu Masani, for example, calls himself a liberal, right? And the agenda of the Swatantra Party is arrived at through a series of compromises, right? There are multiple drafts, as you mentioned, of the party agenda, and people comment on it. There are compromises that are worked out and that kind of thing. And on the one hand, and that I think is very, very rich, right? But at the same time, there seems to be a certain kind of search for ideological neatness, and that kind of coalesces around this idea of conservatism, right? So somehow these ideological heterogeneities are recognized, but at the same time, there is a desire to see that as constituting what you call conservatism. Is that something that you might want to comment upon? But what I find quite interesting is that you don't quite push it to its logical conclusion to make a post-colonial argument about Indian conservatism, So in the spirit of, say, our modernity, our secularism, you don't really talk about our conservatism. And if you do so, what would be the characteristics of that conservatism? And are you at all interested in making that argument? And if not, then why not, right? So, to put it in a slightly more cliched formulation, to what extent does this Indian conservatism represent and constitute a derivative discourse? How much is it drawing from other sources? How much is original and that kind of thing? Yeah. The second, and I think this is very interesting. This is a very broad question, right? Which is, how does the history of ideas, right, incorporate practices of politics, right? And the last chapter is actually the one which actually talks about how Swatantra actually forges alliances across the spectrum, by working out, terms of engagement with other opposition parties. But in some ways, it seems to me that, there's a way in which you kind of almost decide that the problem that the Swatantra Party leaders had with the Congress was entirely ideological. But that is not the case, right? In some ways, I mean, I don't claim to know a huge lot about Rajaji. I'm sure you know far, far more. But whatever little one knows about Rajaji, it seems clear. Please correct me if I'm wrong, right? Which is that, initially Rajaji becomes the Governor General of India, right? And
Governor of West Bengal.
no, I mean, before that, after that Governor General of India, then actually it is Nehru who wants him to become the president, right? Whereas Vallabhbhai Patel wants Dr. Rajendra Prasad as the president of the Constituent Assembly to become the president, right? So in some ways, it seems that in the earlier years, his ally in the Congress party is Nehru and not Patel and Rajendra Prasad. And even later, the relationship between Patel and Nehru becomes so toxic, and Rajendra Prasad, that he is brought into the cabinet by Nehru as a minister without portfolio, chiefly to actually mediate between Rajendra Prasad, the president, and the Home Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel. And so it seems that till the 1950s, at least, is very much allied to Nehru within the party. So what really happens, because in the ideological battle, it seems that, he has much better relationship with Nehru than with Patel, right? I may be entirely wrong. This is textbook knowledge, so correct me, right? Then how does one accommodate these kinds of histories into a history of ideas? Thank you.
Yeah, if you can take 2 minutes to respond, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience.
Sure. As I expected, Ishan had wonderfully thoughtful things to say, so thank you for that. So on this question of, let me take the second question first. Okay. So on the specific point about Rajgopalachari and Nehru, I would say that there are a couple of things taking place. So the differences are not, of course, not just ideological, and I point out in the book that Rajgopalachari in many ways feels pretty betrayed by the Congress, right? So somebody who is basically originally picked to be Gandhi's successor, but then he, falls out of many things, but especially on Quit India, right? He opposes Quit India because he believes in cooperation with the British to, secure India's freedom, and that creates some, distance even with a figure like Nehru, right? That's one thing. He was always Congress, right? Nehru was never Congress, right? So he was maybe an ally, but there were distinctions drawn there. And even with respect to Gandhi, right? In a sense, Rajgopalachari is the Gandhian par excellence of the constructive program, but he's also somebody who in his writings never looks at wealth as, as associated with sin. It's always excess that is associated with sin. So I think there are some ideological differences. Now, with respect to what happens, I think one is, he's very bitter that there's a guy who was supposed to be succeeding Gandhi is now reduced to minister without portfolio and is given a series of essentially sinecures, right? And then what happens in 1952? You bring this man out of retirement because you've lost you haven't gotten the numbers you want in your Madras elections. The communists have done better, and you essentially, push him through the university constituency or whatever, to get him to be the head of your caretaker government, right? Go after the communists. He does a lot of stuff, and then when he brings out this hereditary education scheme, right? The Congress is not too happy to get rid of him, and there is no support he finds institutionally from them, paving the way for Kamaraj and to ascend and the de-Brahmanization of the Congress. So there is a whole lot of personal bitterness here. There's a whole lot of personal bitterness in the figure of Minu Masani as well, because, and it is one that essentially is that, what has happened to, they feel that the Congress, people in the Congress are too beholden to the left. And of course, it was the left that infiltrated in the CPI that infiltrated in this sort of united front. They took away all of our members from the Congress Socialists that Masani and Jayaprakash Narayan had worked so hard to build. And a similar thing with N.G. Ranga, right? So there is a whole lot of personality clash here, which I suppose with people who are interested in social history of ideas, we don't like to emphasize, right? It should not be about great men, but those are part of it. And I try to mention some of those things in the book. Insofar as the Nehru relationship is concerned, I think you're right, because I think if you look at private correspondences between Nehru, right, or the private advice given to somebody like Lal Bahadur Shastri, Rajgopalachari is writing about nation by nation road building scheme to connect rural areas. That is basically a Keynesian kind of idea. But when it comes to politics, that's a distinction, right? That has to be drawn because, there is a belief that this is a valuable thing to do. And also, of course, if I'm sitting and writing my Ramayana, Mahabharata and getting, hagiographical essays about me once a year in Kalki, whereas if I'm the father opposition leader of the country, and my party has 44 seats, it's a better way to live out my dying years. Right? So there's that as well. And I think that I try to recognize that. So on this whole question of heterogeneity and neatness, right? So in a different forum, I was asked, why do you use the term conservative? Because this is what a very senior political theorist said. Well, but this is actually arguments for capitalism, and capitalism is a violent process, blah blah blah. And that's all fair. But every other, we have to understand, I think, conservatism relationally and in a very, very contextually specific format, right? And so if you stand in 1959, right, Swatantra is pretty much to the right of everybody else, including the Bharatiya Janata, I might add, who pay lip service or whatever to socialism, and the economic ideas that are developed, that I've kind of worked on other pieces, are not in any way, the kind of whatever liberalization sort of argument. So I think that's very important. And if we all have to go off of some kind of definition. So going off of this idea of conservatism as trying to preserve the social order, right, relative to what other opportunities are, I think that's significant. Having said that, your paid up free market person, right, or even your paid up Marxist theoretician would say that capitalism will undermine the foundations of feudalism, right? And so the irony is, of course, that to get the numbers, many of these conservative movements have your economic conservatives who are arguing for free markets, but then that's with a dash of social or religious conservatism, which you can see there's a coalition that we have today. But of course, if you were to follow the economics to a logical conclusion, it would undermine the very foundations of their popular mobilization. So that's how I would respond.
So, it is now time for me to thank you again, both of you, Aditya and Ishan, for this wonderful presentation and discussion. I would also like to inform all of you that our next seminar will take place on Monday next week. Sukadeo Thorat will come to present a paper entitled "The Untouchables in Markets: Discrimination in Labor Employment, Farming and Enterprises Business as Sources of Their High Poverty." You're all welcome. Thank you again to all of you, and see you next time.
Thank you.